Imagine me at age 12. Not very different looking from now, except slightly more baby-faced and a lot more awkward looking. Imagine me plopped in the middle of the woods of Washington State, completely alone, 5 or so miles from the border of Canada. I'm whittling sticks, impressing myself with the solid pile I've got going. With a stomach full of the canned tuna and dry crackers I had consumed earlier, I'm grumbling to myself. I'm annoyed that I'm alone in the woods with no sense of time. I'm annoyed that I have to wait for my instructors to come get me. I'm annoyed that my parents sent me to this Outward Bound program to get me off my phone. And I am especially annoyed that all of the kids on this program with me are pretending like they're all sorts of enlightened now. My instructors kept telling us we'd have a revelation. We'd have an aha moment where we realize all we need is ourselves, not the constructs of society. Sitting there whittling my sticks, I didn't understand how canoeing for hours on end until my arms felt like lead would lead me to have this new mindset. Sure, I was having a good time, but where was my aha moment? I was setting up tents and hanging 60 pounds of gear in trees away from bears every night, just like everybody else. All of the other kids were having their earth-shattering realizations, or pretending to, at least, so why wasn't I? Outward Bound is an outdoor education program that sends people of all ages to different areas in the world, learning to live off the grid, focusing on self-improvement and all that profound, enlightening stuff. On the final day, each kid had a mandatory sit-down with one of our instructors. A heart-to-heart where we discussed the goals we came to Outward Bound with, our strengths and our weaknesses. My instructor spent the first part of this talk asking about my goals. I spent nearly all of that time smiling and nodding, naming stereotypical goals and efforts to sound reflective about self-improvement, something I really wasn't keen on at the ripe age of 12. However, I began to listen when she brought up my strengths and weaknesses, interested in what she would say about me, my favorite subject at age 12. She started by saying, "I think your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness." Great, just what I wanted to hear. Not sure how I was supposed to work around that one. She explained that I had a talent for putting others before myself. I said yes whenever I was asked to do tasks, solely because I loved to take the load off of other people's shoulders, and because I was an obsessive people pleaser. My 12-year-old self was quite flattered and feeling pretty high and mighty towards the fact that she was making me sound like a saint. I couldn't wrap my head around how this could be a weakness. Wasn't compassion a good thing? My instructor continued, explaining to me that my strength could often result in explosions due to a phenomenon called compassion fatigue. I kept saying yes to tasks I didn't want to do. I continued putting others before myself, which was not healthy. I had never even considered this concept. The term compassion fatigue was something I had never heard of. But as much as I hated to admit it, it sort of made sense. Still, I came home from Outward Bound not really giving the term compassion fatigue a second thought, even after the talk with my instructor. I can't recall when exactly the conversation I had with my instructor surfaced in my head again. It might have been something as fleeting as a smell or a sound, but suddenly I could not stop thinking about our conversation about compassion fatigue. Suddenly, everything seemed to make sense. It was as if the revelation I was supposed to have at Outward Bound hit me months later. Compassion fatigue, as defined by the dictionary, is a condition characterized by a gradual lessening of compassion over time. Often found in nurses, veterans, and other caregivers, this feeling coined compassion fatigue possesses the ability to make those suffering from it feel isolated and apathetic. However, compassion fatigue does not only fit within the borders of nurses and vets. I can bet nearly everybody in this room has experienced some version of this feeling at one time or another. From my experience, the term compassion fatigue gives a name to the often unexplained feeling of emptiness, longing, and even anger, resulting in caring about everybody and everything except for yourself. I finally understood why, at age 8, I was so angry when my parents got divorced and remarried, and then immediately moved us around the country. Thankfully, we are able to joke about it now and see the positive outcomes, but at the time it wasn't so easy. I understood why I became almost numb to the forced changes that came with 2 countries, 4 states, 7 schools, and 10 houses when my dad began hopping from bank to bank, trying to find one that would suit his amazing skills and work ethic. My brothers struggled, both becoming antisocial, which sharply contrasted with their usual outgoing personalities. So I tried to avoid sibling arguments at all costs. I tried to talk to them about things I knew made them happy, attempting to distract them from their homesickness. My mom's stress was palpable as she tried to drive the 5.5 hours to Cleveland constantly, desperately trying to keep us connected, while I tried to do all of the chores I could and be as low maintenance as possible. I spent every day with a smile on my face, trying to prove I was just fine in our new house and my parents didn't need to worry about me. I tried my hardest to not be another bullet point on their list of things to stress about. It wasn't until I considered the idea of compassion fatigue that I realized I had spent little to no time focusing on myself and how I was dealing with the chaos in my life. I never gave myself a chance to heal. I had never even taken a second to ask myself what I could do for me. Now, I'm not discouraging compassion. I believe it's one of the most important traits a person can have. However, I rarely listened to what I actually wanted. When my whole body was screaming at me to say no because I was exhausted, I would still force a smile and accept the task I was being asked to do. At a certain point, these habits would lead to an explosion. I would become angry, convincing myself I was the only one in the room who cared about other people. The awful weight of this feeling followed me to high school. I was now completely aware of my weakness, but it was like a train that I could not slow down. I've always been a lover of birthdays, becoming known as the one who would always bring balloons and my mom's famous chocolate chip cookies for my friends' birthdays because I love seeing the smiles on their faces. I take on tasks, doing everything and anything I can to bring my friends relief. I began to get upset when I felt as though I wasn't getting appreciation for what I did, or when I felt as though people didn't feel the same care for me as I did for them. I gave my all into every friendship I had. I set expectations for how I felt I deserved to be treated. When these unrealistic expectations weren't met, I shut down, quietly upsetting myself and distancing myself with no explanation. To add on to that, I started blaming myself when my mom agreed to live with me here in Texas so I could continue school at TMI, while my dad took a job in Cleveland. I overanalyzed everything. I convinced myself I was an inconsiderate daughter for forcing them to maintain their marriage across the country, even after they insisted they were fully willing to live apart from me. I was driving myself crazy, isolating myself from those close to me, leaving them completely unaware of what was happening. At some point last year, I finally began to realize what I was doing to myself. I became terrified that without realizing it, I was only doing things for others in order to gain their appreciation to make myself feel better. I wondered if I was ultimately a selfish person, exhibiting compassion for my own gain. I was sick and exhausted of feeling scared, angry, and disappointed. So I became hyper-aware of my actions, introspecting as often as I could. I paid careful attention to my actions and the emotions that came from them. I realized, to my relief, I genuinely do love giving, and it wasn't for my own gain. I also realized it wasn't others' faults that they unknowingly failed to meet my irrational expectations. These understandings were a small step in the right direction, but something still needed to change. I was all consumed by my need to please others. My greatest strength was indeed my greatest weakness. I went back and forth trying to decide if I should give my chapel talk on this. The subject of compassion fatigue is a touchy one because there's a fine line between getting the message across and sounding like I'm trying to convince you all that I'm just the most saintly person but it's just so sad that I'm so nice that it hurts sometimes, and oh, my life is so hard. But I remembered a conversation I had with a very exasperated Mrs. Bilbrey, who expressed how upset it made her that nobody at this school knows how to say no, including her. We all say yes out of the fear that we'll disappoint those around us. After Mrs. Bilbrey brought this so clearly to my attention, I realized that compassion fatigue is not a problem unique to me at all. Of course, caregivers like nurses struggle with it in a more intense way. But my newfound definition of compassion fatigue, the feeling of anger and helplessness that comes from neglecting yourself, applies to most of us here. But nobody wants to discuss it out of the fear that they'll sound self-centered. We forget that we're allowed to say no if we don't want to do something. We forget we're allowed to focus on ourselves while simultaneously focusing on others. We forget that we can compassionately give to others while also giving to ourselves. Self-care is just as significant as caring for those around you. If you want to be able to care for others properly, you must care for yourself first. You simply cannot pour from an empty cup. I still struggle with finding my balance, finding myself frustrated every so often, feeling like I'm giving more than I'm receiving. In times like these, I cannot stress enough how necessary it is to register your emotions, to fully understand why you're feeling the way that you are, and to take time for yourself. Say no. I promise you they'll get over it. It isn't worth the negative feelings that may come from saying yes to something you are too exhausted to do. Of course, when your mom asks you to walk the dog or your friend asks you to be there for them, saying yes is the decent thing to do. But when you're emotionally drained, when the task doesn't need to be completed by you, having the courage to say no is essential. Self-care isn't just buying yourself your favorite food, doing a face mask, or spending way too much money on that one pair of shoes. Self-care also involves taking time to put yourself first. In Greek mythology, the Titan Atlas was given the punishment of holding the heavens for all of eternity. There's no reason for you to resemble Atlas. You deserve no punishment, so don't let your compassion turn into one. There's no reason to let yourself hold the weight of obsessively caring for others for the rest of your life. Instead, find your balance. Find how to be kind-hearted to others while simultaneously being kind-hearted to yourself. It's what you deserve. Thank you.